Imagine a government so advanced, so brilliantly designed, that it would inspire the founding fathers of the United States over 1,000 years after its creation. A democracy where women held the ultimate political power. A constitution memorized through intricate beadwork and passed down through generations without a single written word. An alliance so mighty that European superpowers would bow before its authority and beg for its favor. This is not a fantasy. This is not mythology. This is a true story of the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, known to history as the Iroquois Confederacy, long before the Declaration of Independence was signed, before the Magna Carta was sealed, before most of the world had even conceived of representative democracy. 5 nations came together under a great white pine and buried their weapons of war. They created something the world had never seen, a perfect union, a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Sound familiar? Benjamin Franklin studied them. Thomas Jefferson learned from them. The United States Congress acknowledged their influence, yet their story has been hidden, diminished, nearly erased from the pages of history. But tonight, we resurrect the truth. Tonight, we journey back to a time when the forests of the Northeast belonged to the most powerful alliance in North America. Tonight, we discover how 6 nations became one mind, one heart, one unstoppable force that would shape the destiny of an entire continent. This is a story of warriors and peacemakers, of visionaries and survivors, of 1,000 years of power, unity, and resilience that echo into our present day. The great law of peace is calling. Will you answer? They call themselves Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, but the world knows them as the Iroquois, a name given by their enemies that somehow stuck through centuries of history. 6 nations united as one: the Mohawk keepers of the Eastern Door, the Oneida people of the Standing Stone, the Onondaga keepers of the Central Fire, and the Wampum Records, the Cayuga people of the Great Swamp, the Seneca keepers of the Western Door and the largest of the nations, and the Tuscarora who joined the Confederacy in the early 18th century after fleeing colonial violence in the Carolinas, transforming the 5 nations into the 6 nations. Together, they controlled a territory that stretched from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, from the St. Lawrence River to the mountains of Pennsylvania. Their influence reached even further. From the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, nations trembled at the mention of Haudenosaunee warriors. European empires, France and England and the Netherlands, courted their alliance like desperate suitors seeking the hand of a powerful queen. Today, the Haudenosaunee nations still exist. Their territories are smaller now, reduced to reservations scattered across New York, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec. But their sovereignty remains. Their government continues. Their languages, though endangered, still echo through longhouses and council fires. Their traditions, though tested by centuries of oppression, burn bright in the hearts of their descendants. This is not a story of the past. This is a story of survival, of adaptation, of a people who refused to disappear even when the world tried to erase them. This is a story that belongs not just to the Haudenosaunee, but to all of us, because the principles they created, the democracy they built, the peace they forged, these things changed the world forever. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us travel back to a time of blood and chaos, to the darkness that came before the light. Let us meet the visionaries who dared to dream of something better. Before the Great Peace, there was only war. The land that would become the heart of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy knew nothing but violence and grief. The 5 nations, not yet united, turned their weapons against each other in an endless cycle of revenge and bloodshed. Villages burned, crops withered in fields abandoned by the dead. Children grew up knowing only fear and loss. The mourning wars consumed everything. When a person died, their clan demanded retribution. An enemy must be captured or killed to ease the grief of the bereaved. But each death sparked another round of mourning, another war party, another cycle of violence that spiraled without end. The people were trapped in darkness. Some say they had forgotten what peace even looked like. Mothers wept for sons who would never return. Elders despaired that their people would destroy themselves completely. The spirits of the forest mourned alongside them. But in this darkness, a light was born. Among the Huron people, far to the north, a child came into the world under mysterious circumstances. His mother was a virgin, the legends say, visited by a messenger from the Creator. The grandmother, horrified by this impossible birth, tried 3 times to kill the infant. 3 times she threw him through a hole in the ice into the frozen river below. 3 times he appeared the next morning, alive and healthy, cradled in his mother's arms. The grandmother understood then that this child was touched by the divine. He grew into a man unlike any other. The Peacemaker, he would be called, for he came with a message that would transform the world. He spoke of the good mind, of righteousness, and of the great peace that could unite all people under one law. But the Peacemaker had a problem. He stuttered severely. His message was powerful, but his voice could not carry it across the nations. He needed a spokesperson, a partner who could speak the words that would end the wars. He found that partner in the most unlikely place. Among the Onondaga, there lived a man named Hiawatha, but this was not the Hiawatha of Longfellow's poem. That romantic fiction bears almost no resemblance to the real man, the tortured soul who would become the Peacemaker's greatest ally. Hiawatha had lost everything. His daughters, all of them, had died under mysterious and terrible circumstances. Some versions say they were killed by the machinations of Tadoroho, an Onondaga chief so twisted by evil and grief that his body had become deformed, his hair writhing with serpents, his mind consumed by hatred and dark magic. Hiawatha's grief drove him to madness. He wandered the forests, unable to function, unable to think of anything but his losses. He was the embodiment of the mourning wars, a man destroyed by the very cycle of violence and death that plagued all the nations. Then the Peacemaker found him. In the forest, Hiawatha had gathered white shells from the lake bottom, stringing them into patterns that somehow eased his grief. The Peacemaker saw what Hiawatha was doing and understood its profound significance. These shells, these patterns, they could hold memory, they could hold law, they could hold the peace itself. The Peacemaker performed the first condolence ceremony, using Hiawatha's shell strings to wipe away his tears, to clear his throat, to restore his mind. He gave Hiawatha purpose again. Together, they would carry the message of peace to all the nations. But first, they had to face the greatest obstacle, Tadoroho, the twisted sorcerer whose very name inspired terror, who opposed peace with every fiber of his corrupted being. The Peacemaker and Hiawatha approached him not with weapons, but with words, with patience, with compassion. They understood what others did not. Tadoroho was not evil incarnate. He was grief incarnate. He was the living embodiment of what war had done to all of them. To transform him was to transform the cycle itself. 3 times they approached him. 3 times he refused. But on the 3rd approach, they offered him something no one else had: not death, not submission, but honor, respect, a place of importance in the new world they were building. If Tadadaho would accept the great law of peace, he would become the firekeeper of the Grand Council. His name would be remembered forever, not as a monster, but as a founding father of the Confederacy. Each future leader of the Onondaga would take his name and title, transforming his legacy from darkness into light. And Tadodaho accepted. The Peacemaker and Hiawatha combed the serpents from his hair. They straightened his twisted body. They healed his mind. In some versions, this was literal, in others, metaphorical, but the meaning is the same. They transformed the embodiment of war into the guardian of peace. With Tadadaho's acceptance, the final barrier fell. The Mohawk had already joined. The Oneida had come aboard. The Cayuga had accepted the message. The Seneca had seen the wisdom of unity. Now, the Onondaga, the most central and perhaps the most powerful of the nations, joined the Great Peace. The Peacemaker gathered the chiefs under a great white pine tree. The tree of peace, its 4 white roots, stretched to the 4 directions, offering shelter to any nation that would follow the path of peace and righteousness. At its top perched an eagle, ever watchful for threats to the Confederacy. The chiefs brought their weapons of war, their clubs and their arrows, and they buried them in a deep pit beneath the tree. Over that pit they planted the white pine, its roots intertwining with the buried weapons, holding them fast in the earth. As long as the great law stood, those weapons of war would remain buried. The Peacemaker spoke the great law of peace, and the chiefs memorized every word. Hiawatha crafted the first wampum belts, strings of purple and white shell beads woven into patterns that recorded the law, the structure of the Confederacy, the rights and responsibilities of each nation. These were not mere decorations. These were their constitution, readable by those trained to interpret their patterns. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was born, and the world would never be the same. What the Peacemaker created was nothing short of revolutionary, a government so sophisticated, so carefully balanced that it would function effectively for over 1,000 years and counting. A democracy that gave voice to the people centuries before European philosophers would even begin to conceive of such ideas. The Grand Council formed the heart of Confederacy governance. 50 chiefs, called sachems or royana, chosen from specific families within specific clans. Each nation sent a delegation. The Mohawk sent 9, the Oneida sent 9, the Onondaga sent 14, the Cayuga sent 10, the Seneca sent 8. When the Tuscarora joined later, they were adopted as a younger brother to the Oneida and participated through that relationship. But here's what made this system extraordinary. These 50 chiefs were not elected by men. They were not chosen through combat or inherited through male lineage. They were selected by women, specifically by the clan mothers, the eldest and most respected women of each clan. The clan mothers held the ultimate political power in Haudenosaunee society. They chose the chiefs. They could remove the chiefs if those men failed to serve the people with righteousness and wisdom. They held veto power over declarations of war. The men might make speeches and cast votes in council, but the women held the strings that moved them all. This was not symbolic. This was real, functional political power in the hands of women at a time when European women were considered property, when they could not own land, could not vote, could not speak in public forums. The clan system formed the backbone of Haudenosaunee social organization. Each nation was divided into clans, represented by animals: the wolf, the bear, the turtle, the deer, the snipe, the heron, the hawk, the beaver, the eel, Different nations had different clans, but certain clans like wolf, bear, and turtle appeared across all nations. Your clan was your family, not just in your village, but across the entire Confederacy. A Mohawk of the Wolf clan could travel to Seneca territory and be welcomed into the longhouses of Seneca Wolf clan members as family. This created bonds that transcended national boundaries, weaving the Confederacy together at every level of society. Children belonged to their mother's clan, always. This matrilineal system meant that property, names, and political positions passed through the female line. When a man married, he moved into his wife's longhouse and became part of her clan's family structure. His children were not his clan, but hers. This was not a matriarchy in the sense of women dominating men. Rather, it was a carefully balanced system where men and women had distinct but equally important roles. Women controlled domestic space, agriculture, property, and political selection. Men served as chiefs, warriors, and hunters, but neither could function without the other. The Grand Council operated by consensus, not majority rule. This is crucial to understand. A simple majority was not enough to pass a law or make a decision for the Confederacy. All 50 chiefs had to agree, or at least not actively oppose, a measure before it could be adopted. This sounds impossibly cumbersome, but it worked because of the careful structure the Peacemaker had designed. The council was divided into 3 groups: the Mohawk and Seneca, keepers of the eastern and western doors, formed one group. The Oneida and Cayuga formed a second group. The Onondaga, fire keepers, and the most central nation formed the third group. A proposal would be introduced to the council and first debated by the Mohawk and Seneca. If they reached consensus, they passed it to the Oneida and Cayuga. If that second group agreed, it went to the Onondaga for final consideration. The Onondaga could confirm the decision or send it back for further discussion. If all 3 groups agreed, the law was adopted. This system forced deliberation. It prevented hasty decisions. It ensured that every voice was heard, every concern addressed. It created laws that the entire Confederacy could stand behind because everyone had participated in their creation, and the wampum belts recorded it all. These intricate patterns of purple and white shell beads were far more than art. They were mnemonic devices, constitutional documents, historical records, and treaties all woven into portable form. The Hiawatha Belt, one of the most sacred wampum records, shows the original 5 nations of the Confederacy. 4 white squares represent the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca. In the center, a white tree represents the Onondaga, the firekeeper, the heart of the Confederacy. The pattern is simple but profound, a visual representation of unity and distinct identity existing simultaneously. The 2-row wampum, given to Dutch colonists in the early 17th century, shows 2 parallel purple rows on a white background. The rows represent a Haudenosaunee canoe and a European ship, traveling side by side on the river of life. Neither tries to steer the other's vessel. Each respects the other's path. This was the Haudenosaunee vision of coexistence, of mutual respect and non-interference. Wampum keepers, specially trained individuals, memorize the meaning of each belt, the speeches associated with them, the historical context of their creation. When a belt was presented at council or in negotiations with other nations, the keeper would read its message, reciting from memory the words and agreements it represented. This was their constitution. This was their library. This was their legal code, and it worked with remarkable efficiency for centuries. The great law of peace itself, the Kayanerakawa contained over 100 articles covering everything from the selection and duties of chiefs to the process for adopting new nations into the Confederacy, from environmental stewardship to the rights of common people to address the Grand Council. It spoke of the 7 generations principle. When making any decision, the chiefs were instructed to consider the impact on the 7th generation into the future, not just immediate consequences, but the long-term effects on their descendants and the land itself. This was sustainability embedded into constitutional law hundreds of years before the modern environmental movement would discover the concept. The law protected freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the rights of the people to remove leaders who abused their power. It established a system of checks and balances where no individual or group could accumulate too much authority. It created a government that was both stable and flexible, capable of adapting to new challenges while maintaining its core principles. And perhaps most remarkably, it worked not through force, but through voluntary adherence. The Confederacy had no police force to enforce its laws, no standing army to compel obedience. People followed the great law because they believed in it, because it served them well, because it created a society worth preserving. This was the government that the Founding Fathers studied. This was the democracy that predated European Enlightenment philosophy. This was a sophisticated political system that the colonial world dismissed as savage. The Haudenosaunee knew better. They had created something extraordinary, and they had created it not through conquest or divine right, but through wisdom, compromise, and an unwavering commitment to peace and unity. Step inside a longhouse, and you step into the physical embodiment of Haudenosaunee society. These structures, sometimes stretching over 100 feet in length, housed entire extended families under one roof of elm bark and wooden frames. The longhouse was oriented east to west, with doors at each end and smoke holes dotting the peaked roof. Inside, a central corridor ran the length of the building, with raised platforms along both sides, creating living spaces for individual families. Each family had their own fire, shared with the family directly across the corridor. The smoke from these fires rose through the roof holes, but the interior was still perpetually hazy, scented with wood smoke and the earthy smell of dried corn and herbs hanging from the rafters. 20, 30, sometimes 50 or more people lived in a single longhouse, all related through the female line, all belonging to the same clan. The eldest clan mother presided over this domestic kingdom with authority that extended far beyond the walls of her home. Imagine the sound of it. Children playing and arguing, women grinding corn, scraping hides, weaving baskets and crafting pottery, men repairing weapons and tools, telling stories of hunts and battles, elders teaching the young, passing down knowledge through story and song, dogs sleeping by the fires, the whole structure alive with the rhythm of life, lived communally. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist, but neither did isolation. You were never alone, never without support, never outside the embrace of family. When you were sick, the community cared for you. When you grieved, they mourned with you. When you celebrated, they danced at your side. The longhouse was more than shelter. It was a symbol. The Haudenosaunee called themselves the people of the longhouse because the Confederacy itself was conceived as one great longhouse stretching across the land. The Mohawk guarded the eastern door. The Seneca guarded the western door. The Onondaga tended the central fire. All the nations lived together under one roof, distinct families, in a shared home. Outside the longhouse, the landscape of a Haudenosaunee village bustled with activity. Fields of corn stretched toward the forest edge. The tall stalks interplanted with climbing bean vines and sprawling squash plants in a technique so effective that colonists would adopt it wholesale. The three sisters, they called this agricultural trinity, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a relationship of mutual support. The corn stalks provided a pole for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, feeding the corn. The squash spread their broad leaves across the ground, shading out weeds and retaining moisture. Together, they produced abundant harvests with minimal labor. This was sophisticated agriculture developed over thousands of years of experimentation and observation. The Haudenosaunee cultivated dozens of varieties of corn, selecting for different characteristics: flour corn for grinding, flint corn for storage, sweet corn for roasting. Each variety adapted to specific uses and growing conditions. They grew far more than the three sisters: sunflowers for their seeds and oil, tobacco for ceremonies, herbs for medicine and flavoring, pumpkins and gourds. Wild plants were cultivated in forest gardens, managed landscapes that appeared natural but were actually carefully tended to increase yields of useful species. The women controlled this agricultural wealth. They planted, tended, and harvested the crops. They decided how the surplus would be distributed and stored. This was not merely labor. This was economic and political power. In a society where agriculture provided the majority of calories, controlling food production meant controlling everything. The rhythm of life followed the seasons. Winter was a time of storytelling, craft work, and ceremonies. Families stayed close to the fires, living off the dried corn, beans, and squash stored in underground pits and hanging from longhouse rafters. This was when the faithkeeper would recite the creation stories, teaching the young about Sky Woman and the birth of the world on Turtle's Back. Spring brought the maple sugar season. Families moved to sugar camps in the forest, tapping the trees and boiling the sap into sweet syrup and sugar. This was a time of renewal, of thanksgiving for the tree's gifts, of preparation for the planting season ahead. Summer meant hard work in the fields, but also abundance. Strawberries ripened, the first fruit of the season and cause for celebration with the Strawberry Festival. Green corn ceremonies marked the early harvest. Fishing and gathering supplemented the cultivated crops. Fall brought the main harvest and frantic activity to preserve food for winter. Corn was dried and stored. Squash were preserved. Beans were shelled and cached. Hunting parties left for extended expeditions, seeking deer, bear, and elk to provide meat and hides for the cold months ahead. But life was not all work. The Haudenosaunee were master artisans, creating objects of remarkable beauty and utility. Women wove baskets so tightly they could hold water. They crafted pottery decorated with intricate designs. They embroidered clothing with porcupine quills, dyed in brilliant colors, later adopting glass beads from European trade to create even more elaborate designs. Men carved intricate wooden masks representing forest spirits and disease demons. These false-face society masks were sacred objects, used in healing ceremonies to drive away illness. Each mask was unique, carved directly into a living tree, and then carefully removed, a process that infused the mask with the tree's living spirit. They created wampum, the purple and white shell beads that served as both art and communication. Making wampum was painstaking work. The shells had to be collected, cut into small cylinders, drilled with stone or bone awls, polished smooth, and then carefully strung or woven into belts and strings. A single belt might represent hundreds of hours of labor, and they played, Lacrosse, the creator's game, was both sport and spiritual practice. Entire villages would compete in matches that lasted for hours or even days, with goals sometimes set a mile apart, hundreds of players on each side, the ball flying through the air, men running and dodging and checking each other with a physicality that could be brutal. But lacrosse was more than competition. It was medicine. It was prayer. It was training for war. It was a way to resolve disputes between communities without bloodshed. It was entertainment and ritual combined, played to heal the sick, to bring rain, to honor the Creator. The False Face Society was just one of several medicine societies that maintained the spiritual and physical health of the community. These societies possessed sacred knowledge of healing plants, rituals, and songs passed down through generations. When someone fell ill, the appropriate society would be called to perform their ceremonies, donning their masks and rattles to drive away the diseased spirits. The calendar was marked not by numbered months, but by 13 moons, each with its own name and associated ceremonies. The midwinter ceremony, lasting for days, marked the new year with purification rites, dream sharing, and the ritual stirring of ashes. The green corn ceremony celebrated the harvest. The strawberry festival gave thanks for the first fruits. Each ceremony reinforced the relationship between the people and the natural world, acknowledging their dependence on the Creator's gifts. Dreams held profound significance. A person who had a powerful dream might share it with the community, and others would work to fulfill the dream's wishes, understanding that dreams were messages from the spirit world that required action in the waking world. This was a culture of reciprocity. You gave to the community because the community gave to you. You honored the plants and animals because they gave their lives to sustain yours. You participated in ceremonies not out of obligation, but out of recognition that you were part of a web of relationships extending from the smallest insect to the Creator itself. The Haudenosaunee did not see themselves as separate from or superior to nature. They were part of it, embedded in it, responsible to it. The deer you hunted was your brother. You thanked him for his sacrifice. The corn you planted was your mother. You honored her generosity. The forest was your home, not a resource to be exploited, but a community to be tended. This worldview would clash catastrophically with European ideas of dominion and ownership. But for the Haudenosaunee, it was simply the truth of existence. Everything was connected. Everything had spirit. Everything deserved respect. And when you lived by these principles, the world provided everything you needed. Make no mistake, the Haudenosaunee were not pacifists. The great law of peace governed relations within the Confederacy, but beyond its borders, Haudenosaunee warriors were feared across half a continent. They fought with a sophistication that stunned European military observers. Hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, deception, mobility. They moved through forests that European soldiers found impenetrable. They struck without warning and vanished like ghosts. They mastered the psychology of warfare, using terror as a weapon as effective as any arrow or club. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century demonstrated Haudenosaunee military power at its height. As the fur trade with Europeans intensified, beaver pelts became currency, and beaver populations became depleted. The Haudenosaunee, particularly the Mohawk and Seneca, launched aggressive campaigns to control hunting territories and trade routes, attacking neighboring nations with devastating effectiveness. The Huron Confederacy, once more powerful than the Haudenosaunee themselves, were scattered and nearly destroyed. Survivors fled west or were absorbed into the Haudenosaunee nations. The Peton the Neutral Nation, the Erie, the Susquehannock, all fell before Haudenosaunee expansion. Some were destroyed outright. Others were conquered and adopted. Their people integrated into Haudenosaunee clans through the ritual of condolence. This was the mourning war tradition adapted to new circumstances. When a clan member died, that death created a hole in the social fabric that demanded filling. A war party would be organized to capture enemies. Some captives would be adopted to literally replace the deceased, taking their name, their position in the family, their identity. They would become Haudenosaunee in every sense, fully integrated into the community. Other captives faced darker fates. Torture and ritual execution served both spiritual and psychological purposes. The torture tested the captives' courage. If they faced death with bravery, singing their death song without showing fear, they were honored even as they were killed. Their courage would be absorbed by those who witnessed it. Their death would satisfy the grief of the mourning clan. To European sensibilities, this was savagery. But the Haudenosaunee saw it differently. Death in battle was honorable. The rituals surrounding captivity and torture were deeply embedded in their understanding of life, death, and the spirit world. The Europeans who viewed these practices with horror thought nothing of their own public executions, their burnings at the stake, their drawing and quartering of criminals. Violence takes many forms, and every culture finds ways to justify its own. What made the Haudenosaunee particularly formidable was not merely their warrior skill, but their diplomatic sophistication. They understood that military power without diplomatic acumen was ultimately self-defeating. They built alliances. They played European powers against each other. They positioned themselves as the keystone that held the balance of power in northeastern North America. The French wanted Haudenosaunee alliance to secure their fur trade and protect New France. The Dutch needed Haudenosaunee cooperation to maintain their colony at New Amsterdam. The English, when they took over from the Dutch, recognized that controlling the Hudson and Mohawk River valleys required Haudenosaunee consent. The Haudenosaunee granted that consent, or withheld it, based on calculated assessment of their own interests. They traded with all the European powers. They allied with whoever offered the best terms. And they were not above switching sides when circumstances change. The covenant chain became the framework for Haudenosaunee-British relations, symbolically represented as a great silver chain linking the Confederacy to the British Crown. This alliance was renewed periodically through elaborate diplomatic ceremonies involving gift exchanges, wampum presentations, and lengthy speeches recounting the history of the relationship. But the covenant chain was not a simple alliance. It was a complex web of mutual obligations and carefully negotiated terms. The British needed Haudenosaunee warriors to fight their battles against the French. They needed Haudenosaunee permission to settle new lands. They needed Haudenosaunee trade to maintain their economy. The Haudenosaunee, in turn, needed European trade goods. Metal tools and weapons were superior to stone and bone. Wool cloth was warmer and more durable than hide. Glass beads were easier to work than porcupine quills. But they did not need Europeans so desperately that they would surrender their sovereignty or their land without negotiation. Haudenosaunee diplomats moved between Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Montreal, and Quebec with the confidence of representatives from a great power, because that is what they were. Colonial officials treated them as equals, not out of respect alone, but out of necessity. The Haudenosaunee could make or break colonial ventures with a word. When Europeans gathered for treaty negotiations, Haudenosaunee Sachems brought wampum belts and spoke in elaborate metaphors rich with symbolic meaning. They began with condolence ceremonies, clearing the eyes of tears, the ears of obstruction, the throat of grief, so that all parties could see, hear, and speak clearly. This was not mere ritual. It was psychological preparation, creating the proper mindset for productive negotiation. They spoke of polishing the chain, keeping it bright and free from rust. They spoke of the path between their peoples, keeping it clear of obstacles. They spoke of council fires, keeping them burning so that representatives could always gather in peace. Each metaphor carried layers of meaning, and European diplomats who failed to understand these nuances often found themselves at a disadvantage. The Haudenosaunee also understood demographic realities. European diseases had devastated their populations, as they had devastated all Native American peoples. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, these invisible enemies killed far more effectively than any European army. By the 18th century, the Haudenosaunee population had been reduced to perhaps 15,000 people, from pre-contact levels that may have been twice or 3 times that number. But through the mourning wars and adoptions, they replenished their numbers. Captives from other native nations were adopted into Haudenosaunee clans. Some Europeans, particularly children, were also adopted and raised as Haudenosaunee. Many of these adoptees, given the choice to return to European society, chose to stay. They had found a life in Haudenosaunee communities that they preferred to what they had known before. This adaptive strategy allowed the Confederacy to maintain its power despite demographic decline. A Seneca village might be half filled with people born elsewhere, but they were Seneca now, fully integrated and committed to the Confederacy's survival. By the mid-18th century, the Haudenosaunee stood at the height of their power and influence. They dominated the Northeast. They controlled crucial trade routes. They held the balance between French and British imperial ambitions. They were courted, feared, and respected by all who encountered them. But this position was precarious. The European powers were growing stronger, colonial populations were exploding, land hunger was insatiable. The demographic balance that had allowed the Haudenosaunee to play European rivals against each other was shifting, and a storm was coming that would test the Confederacy as it had never been tested before. The 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, ended in 1763 with total British victory. France was expelled from mainland North America. The Haudenosaunee, who had allied with the British, found themselves in a new and dangerous situation. Before, they had leveraged the rivalry between French and British to maintain their independence. If the British pushed too hard, the Haudenosaunee could threaten to ally with France. If the French became too demanding, they could turn to the British. This balance of power had served them well for over a century. Now that balance was gone. The British no longer needed to court Haudenosaunee favor as desperately, and British colonists, no longer restrained by fear of French-backed native resistance, began pouring across the Appalachian Mountains into territories the Haudenosaunee considered their hunting grounds. The Proclamation of 1763, issued by the British Crown, attempted to halt this westward expansion. It drew a line along the Appalachian Ridge and declared that colonists could not settle beyond it without native consent. The Haudenosaunee and other nations viewed this as a promise that their lands would be protected, but the proclamation was unenforceable. Colonial governments ignored it. Settlers ignored it. Land speculators ignored it. and the British government, thousands of miles away and increasingly distracted by conflicts with its own colonists, lacked the will or ability to enforce it. Tensions rose. The Haudenosaunee watched as forests were cleared, as game was driven away, as their world was transformed by an influx of settlers who did not respect native sovereignty or native rights. Some Haudenosaunee leaders argued for accommodation, for finding ways to live alongside the colonists. Others called for resistance. Then came 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution split the British Empire and forced the Haudenosaunee to make an impossible choice: side with the British, their longtime allies, or remain neutral, or support the American rebels. The Grand Council met and debated. For the first time in the Confederacy's history, they could not reach consensus. The Oneida and Tuscarora leaned toward supporting the Americans. The Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca favored the British. The unity that had defined the Haudenosaunee for centuries began to crack. The decision was made to allow each nation to choose its own path, to cover the council fire and let each nation act independently until the conflict ended. This was unprecedented. This was a fundamental violation of the Confederacy's principles. But the alternative was civil war within the Confederacy itself. The Mohawk, led by the formidable war chief Thayendanegea, known to the British as Joseph Brant, fought fiercely for the British cause. Brant was a complex figure, educated in colonial schools, fluent in English, a translator of Anglican prayers into Mohawk, and a skilled diplomat as well as a warrior. He believed that British victory offered the best hope for protecting Haudenosaunee lands from American expansion. Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca warriors joined British forces in devastating raids on American frontier settlements. The Cherry Valley Massacre, the Wyoming Valley Massacre, these events terrified American settlers and hardened their hatred of the Haudenosaunee. The Oneida and Tuscarora, influenced by the missionary Samuel Kirkland and convinced that the American cause would prevail, allied with the rebels. Oneida warriors fought alongside American forces. Oneida women fed and sheltered Washington's starving army at Valley Forge. They gambled that American gratitude would protect their lands after the war. Both sides were wrong. In 1779, George Washington ordered a campaign of total destruction against the Haudenosaunee nations allied with Britain. The Sullivan-Clinton campaign, as it became known, was one of the largest military operations of the Revolutionary War. Over 4,000 Continental Army soldiers marched into Haudenosaunee territory with explicit orders to destroy, to burn, to devastate so completely that the nations would never recover, and they did. 40 Haudenosaunee towns were burned to the ground. Orchards that had grown for generations were cut down. Thousands of acres of crops ready for harvest were destroyed. Food stores were burned. The winter of 1779 to 80 was called the Winter of the Hard Cold. Haudenosaunee refugees fled to Fort Niagara, dependent on British charity for survival. Hundreds died of cold and starvation. The campaign did not break Haudenosaunee military resistance. Raids on American settlements continued and even intensified, but it shattered the economic base that had supported Haudenosaunee power. The fields, the orchards, the towns that had sustained a sophisticated civilization for centuries were reduced to ash. When the war ended in 1783, the Treaty of Paris gave Britain's American territories to the new United States. The Haudenosaunee, not party to the negotiations, were not mentioned. Their British allies, desperate for peace, abandoned them without protecting their interests or their lands. The Americans treated the Haudenosaunee as conquered peoples. At Fort Stanwix in 1784, American commissioners demanded that the Haudenosaunee cede vast territories as punishment for their alliance with Britain. The sachems who attended, lacking the authority to make such agreements and coerced by the threat of military force, signed treaties that gave away millions of acres. The Oneida and Tuskegee, who had allied with the Americans, expected reward for their loyalty. Instead, they found that American gratitude was hollow. Land speculators descended on their territories. State governments, particularly New York, negotiated dubious treaties that stripped away Oneida lands, despite federal laws requiring congressional approval for such agreements. Joseph Brant led thousands of Mohawk refugees into Canada, where the British granted them land along the Grand River in Ontario. The Six Nations Reserve was established there, and it endures to this day. A Haudenosaunee community on foreign soil, exiled from their ancestral homeland. Many Seneca, Onondaga, and Cayuga remained in New York, clinging to reduced territories that were mere fragments of what they had once controlled. The Tuscarora were given a small reservation in New York. The Oneida, seeing their lands stripped away despite their service to the American cause, eventually split, with some moving to Wisconsin and Ontario, while others remained on a tiny reservation in New York. The Confederacy survived, but it was broken. The council fire had been scattered. The nations were divided geographically and politically. The great law of peace still existed, but the power to enforce it, the territory to sustain it, the unity to uphold it, all these had been shattered, and the Americans were just getting started. The 19th century brought a new kind of warfare, not the open conflict of armies and battles, but the slow, grinding assault of policies designed to erase Haudenosaunee identity, culture, and sovereignty. If the Americans could not destroy the Haudenosaunee by force, they would destroy them by assimilation. The reservation system confined the once powerful Confederacy to small parcels of land. The Seneca clung to several reservations in western New York. The Onondaga maintained a reservation south of Syracuse. The Oneida held a tiny territory near their ancestral homeland. The Mohawk were split between small reservations in New York and larger communities in Canada. The Cayuga, displaced entirely from their homeland, scattered among other Haudenosaunee communities or moved to Oklahoma. These reservations were surrounded by American settlements, isolated islands in a hostile sea. State and federal governments, land companies, and individual settlers all worked to reduce even these small territories. Fraudulent treaties, legal manipulations, and outright theft stripped away acreage year after year. The Ogden Land Company, granted preemption rights to purchase Seneca lands in New York, pressured the Seneca to sell through bribes, alcohol, and manipulation. The Treaty of Buffalo Creek in 1838 called for the removal of all Seneca to Kansas, following the model of Indian removal that had devastated southeastern nations like the Cherokee. But the Seneca resisted. Haudenosaunee women, particularly, organized opposition to removal. The clan mothers used their political authority to depose chiefs who supported the treaty. They rallied their communities, they hired lawyers, they lobbied in Washington, and they won, at least partially. The Treaty of Buffalo Creek was modified. Some Seneca reservations were lost, but others were retained. The Seneca would not be removed to Kansas. This victory came at tremendous cost and demonstrated a painful reality. Haudenosaunee survival now depended on navigating American legal systems, on lobbying American politicians, on fighting battles in courtrooms rather than forests. The federal government, meanwhile, pursued policies explicitly designed to destroy Native cultures. The civilization program of the early 19th century aimed to transform Native peoples into Christian farmers who would abandon their languages, their religions, their communal land ownership, and their traditional governance. Missionaries descended on Haudenosaunee reservations, establishing churches and schools. Some Haudenosaunee converted to Christianity, seeing it as a path to coexistence with American society. Others maintained traditional beliefs, sometimes blending them with Christian elements and syncretic practices. The Handsome Lake religion, founded by the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake in the early 1800s, represented one such syncretism. Handsome Lake had a series of visions in which he received messages from the Creator. His teachings, known as the Code of Handsome Lake or the Longhouse religion, combined traditional Haudenosaunee beliefs with elements borrowed from Quaker Christianity. Handsome Lake preached against alcohol, which had devastated Haudenosaunee communities. He advocated for strong families, for agriculture, for education, but he also emphasized traditional ceremonies, the importance of the Haudenosaunee language, and adherence to the great law of peace. His religion became a vehicle for cultural survival, a way to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining core Haudenosaunee values, but the assault continued. The Dawes Act of 1887, also called the General Allotment Act, aimed to destroy tribal land ownership by dividing reservations into individual plots. Each Native person would receive a small parcel of land to farm as private property. The remaining reservation land would be declared surplus and sold to white settlers. The Haudenosaunee reservations in New York were largely exempt from the Dawes Act due to previous treaties. But the policy's intent was clear. The federal government wanted to eliminate reservations, tribal governments, and collective Native identity. They wanted to force Native peoples to become individual American citizens, indistinguishable from any other American. And then came the boarding schools, starting in the late 1800s and continuing well into the 20th century. Haudenosaunee children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the Thomas Indian School in New York, and other institutions became engines of cultural destruction. Children as young as 5 were taken from their parents and transported to schools where they were forbidden to speak their languages, forbidden to practice their religions, forbidden to wear their traditional clothing or hairstyles. They were given English names. They were forced to attend Christian services. They were trained in manual labor and domestic service, prepared for lives as servants and laborers in white society. They were punished brutally for any expression of Native identity. Many children died at these schools from disease, from abuse, from heartbreak. Those who survived often returned to their communities traumatized, unable to speak their own language, disconnected from their culture, caught between two worlds, and fully belonging to neither. The trauma of the boarding school era ripples through Haudenosaunee communities to this day. Language loss accelerated, traditional knowledge was interrupted, families were shattered. The intergenerational transfer of culture that had sustained the Haudenosaunee for centuries was deliberately severed. Through all of this, the Haudenosaunee endured. They maintained their governments. They continued to select chiefs according to the great law of peace. They held their ceremonies in secret when necessary, in public when possible. They taught their children what they could. They adapted, they survived, they resisted. The Grand Council continued to meet, even when American authorities denied its legitimacy. The Confederacy maintained its claim to sovereignty, Even when that sovereignty was not recognized, the Haudenosaunee issued their own passports, insisted on their status as a separate nation, refused to be absorbed into the American identity. During World War I and World War II, Haudenosaunee men enlisted in the American military in disproportionate numbers. They served with distinction, earning reputations as skilled soldiers and code talkers whose languages baffled enemy code breakers. But they served not as conquered peoples, but as allies, as members of a sovereign nation, supporting a cause they believed in. After the wars, Haudenosaunee veterans returned to reservations mired in poverty. Economic opportunities were scarce. Education was poor, housing was substandard. The federal government, having failed to destroy Haudenosaunee identity through forced assimilation, now seemed content to let poverty and neglect do the job. But the Haudenosaunee refused to disappear. The second half of the 20th century witnessed a remarkable Haudenosaunee renaissance. What the federal government had tried and failed to destroy through warfare, through treaties, through assimilation policies and boarding schools, came roaring back to life. In 1949, the Grand Council issued a statement to President Harry Truman asserting Haudenosaunee sovereignty and rejecting American citizenship. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a declaration that the Haudenosaunee still existed as a separate nation, that the treaties between the Haudenosaunee and the United States remained valid and binding. Legal battles became the new warfare. The Haudenosaunee nations brought lawsuits challenging illegal land takings, demanding the return of stolen territories, asserting treaty rights to hunt and fish without state regulation. Many of these cases reached the Supreme Court. Some were won, some were lost. But each case reinforced the message that the Haudenosaunee had not surrendered, had not been conquered, had not ceased to exist as sovereign peoples. The Kinza Dam controversy of the 1960s crystallized these struggles. The federal government, seeking to build a flood control dam on the Allegheny River, chose a location that would flood thousands of acres of the Seneca-Allegheny Reservation, despite the Treaty of 1794, which explicitly promised that Seneca lands would never be taken. The Seneca fought the dam. They lobbied Congress. They filed lawsuits. They made impassioned pleas that the United States honor its oldest treaties. But in the end, they lost. The dam was built. 600 Seneca people were forcibly relocated. 10,000 acres of reservation land disappeared under the reservoir's waters. The betrayal galvanized Haudenosaunee activism. If the United States would violate its oldest and most solemn treaty promises, then the Haudenosaunee could not rely on American good faith. They would have to fight for every inch of territory, every scrap of sovereignty, every fragment of their rights. Language revitalization became a critical front in the battle for cultural survival. By the late 20th century, the number of fluent speakers of Haudenosaunee languages had dwindled to a few hundred elderly people. If these elders died without passing on their knowledge, the languages would die with them. Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora language programs were established on reservations and in communities. Immersion schools were created where children learned traditional languages as their primary language. Recording projects documented elders speaking, preserving pronunciations and stories for future generations. The results have been remarkable. While the languages remain endangered, they are not dead. Young people are learning. Babies are being raised hearing their ancestral languages. The chain of transmission, broken by the boarding schools, is being reconnected link by link. Economic development presented both opportunities and challenges. The Federal Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 allowed tribes to operate casinos on reservation lands. Several Haudenosaunee nations opened gaming facilities, generating revenues that funded schools, health clinics, housing, and cultural programs. The Turning Stone Casino, operated by the Oneida Nation, became one of the largest employers in central New York. The Seneca Nation opened casinos that brought millions of dollars in revenue. Gaming provided economic opportunities in communities that had struggled with poverty for generations. But gaming also brought controversy. Traditional Haudenosaunee who oppose gambling on cultural and spiritual grounds clashed with those who saw it as necessary for economic survival. Disputes over gaming revenues sparked political conflicts within nations. And the dependence on gaming revenue created vulnerability to economic downturns and changing public attitudes toward gambling. Beyond gaming, Haudenosaunee nations pursued other economic development strategies. The Mohawk became known for high steel work, with Mohawk ironworkers helping build the bridges and skyscrapers of New York City. Haudenosaunee artists gained recognition for their work in traditional and contemporary forms. Cultural tourism brought visitors to reservations to learn about Haudenosaunee history and culture. Environmental activism became another arena where Haudenosaunee voices gained prominence. The Haudenosaunee have been at the forefront of battles against pollution, mining, and development that threatened their remaining lands and waters. The Onondaga Nation filed a landmark lawsuit seeking the cleanup of Onondaga Lake, one of the most polluted bodies of water in the United States, contaminated by over a century of industrial waste dumping. While the lawsuit was dismissed on technical grounds, it forced national attention on environmental justice and the ongoing impacts of pollution on Native communities. Haudenosaunee activists have opposed fracking, pipeline construction, and mining operations. They have worked to protect water quality, to preserve forests, to maintain the health of the ecosystems they depend on. This activism springs directly from the traditional Haudenosaunee worldview that sees humans as part of nature, responsible for protecting the environment for the 7 generations to come. The Grand Council continues to meet, maintaining the traditions established by the Peacemaker over 1,000 years ago. Chiefs are still selected by clan mothers. Wampum belts are still read and interpreted. The condolence ceremony is still performed when a chief dies and a new one is raised up. The Haudenosaunee still issue their own passports, asserting their status as a separate nation. While these passports are not universally recognized, their very existence is a powerful statement of sovereignty. When a Haudenosaunee lacrosse team was denied entry to an international tournament because officials would not accept Haudenosaunee passports, it sparked international debate about indigenous sovereignty and the right of nations to determine their own citizenship. Today, the Haudenosaunee population numbers around 80,000 people. Though this figure includes both those enrolled in the nations and those of Haudenosaunee descent who may not live on reservations. Communities exist in New York, Ontario, Quebec, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. Some live traditionally, speaking their languages and practicing Longhouse religion. Others are fully integrated into mainstream society while maintaining their Haudenosaunee identity. The challenges remain immense. Poverty rates on many reservations remain high. Substance abuse, diabetes, and other health issues plague communities still dealing with the trauma of colonization. Political disputes sometimes fracture nations internally. The encroachment of outside society continues. But the Haudenosaunee endure. They have survived 400 years of colonization, warfare, disease, forced removal, cultural suppression, and attempted genocide, they have maintained their governments, their identities, their sovereignty against impossible odds. They are still here. They are still Haudenosaunee. They are still the people of the Longhouse. The story of the Haudenosaunee is not a story of the past. It is a story of the present and the future. It is a story that challenges everything we think we know about democracy, about civilization, about what it means to be indigenous in the modern world. When Benjamin Franklin stood before the Continental Congress and proposed a union of the colonies, he explicitly referenced the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. When the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution were being drafted, the Founding Fathers studied Haudenosaunee government, the idea of a federal system of states united under a central government while maintaining their individual sovereignty. This came directly from observing how the Haudenosaunee had balanced national and confederacy authority for centuries. In 1987, the United States Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on the Constitution. The resolution stated that the confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles incorporated into the Constitution itself. This is not a minor historical footnote. This is the recognition that indigenous peoples, dismissed as savages by European colonizers, had created a form of government sophisticated enough to influence the formation of the United States. But the Haudenosaunee legacy extends far beyond governmental structure. The environmental movement's emphasis on sustainability, on considering the long-term impacts of our actions. This echoes the seven generations principle embedded in the Great Law of Peace. The feminist movement's advocacy for women's political and economic power found a model in clan mothers who controlled property and selected leaders centuries before American women gained the right to vote. The Haudenosaunee demonstrated that government by consensus is possible, that unity does not require uniformity, that diverse peoples can work together while maintaining their distinct identities. These lessons feel desperately relevant in our fractured modern world. Today, the Haudenosaunee continue to teach these lessons. They share their history and culture through museums, through schools, through cultural centers and websites and social media. They welcome those who come with genuine respect to learn from their traditions. They also continue to fight for their rights and their sovereignty. Legal battles over land claims, treaty rights, environmental protection, and religious freedom continue in courts across North America. The Haudenosaunee have not conceded defeat. They have not accepted the finality of their dispossession. The story of the Haudenosaunee matters because it reveals truths that dominant historical narratives try to hide. It shows us that indigenous peoples were not primitive savages waiting for European civilization to enlighten them. They were sophisticated societies with complex governments, rich cultures, and profound philosophies. It shows us that colonization was not inevitable progress, but a violent, genocidal process that destroyed civilizations and attempted to erase entire peoples from existence. It shows us that indigenous peoples are not relics of the past, but living communities with contemporary concerns and ongoing struggles for justice. And it shows us that resistance is possible, that cultural survival is possible, that a people can endure centuries of oppression and emerge with their identity intact, their dignity unbroken, their spirit undefeated. The great tree of peace still stands, at least in spirit. Its 4 white roots still reach to the 4 directions, offering shelter to all who would accept the message of righteousness, justice, and peace. The eagle still perches at its top, watching for threats to the Confederacy. The weapons are still buried beneath its roots, a reminder that peace is possible when people choose unity over division, when they consider the welfare of future generations, when they recognize that we are all connected in a web of relationships that extends from the smallest creature to the Creator itself. This is the gift the Haudenosaunee offer the world, not as a dead civilization to be studied in museums, but as a living people with wisdom desperately needed in our troubled times. If you have listened to this story and felt moved, then honor that feeling with action. Learn more about the Haudenosaunee and other indigenous peoples. Support indigenous sovereignty and treaty rights. Recognize that the land you live on likely belongs to indigenous nations by treaty and by right. Visit a Haudenosaunee cultural center. Read books by Haudenosaunee authors. Listen to Haudenosaunee voices, speaking for themselves rather than being spoken about. Support indigenous language revitalization. Support environmental protection efforts led by indigenous communities. Support indigenous youth who are reclaiming their heritage and building their futures. And remember the lessons of the great law of peace. When you make decisions, consider the impact on the 7th generation. When you encounter conflict, seek consensus and understanding rather than victory. When you see injustice, have the courage to stand against it. The Haudenosaunee have survived 1,000 years and more. They will survive 1,000 years to come. They are still here. They are still standing. They are still teaching. Listen, learn, honor their legacy by working for a world where all peoples can live in peace, where sovereignty is respected, where the earth is protected for the generations yet unborn. This has been the story of the Iroquois Confederacy, 1,000 years of power, unity, and resilience. But the story is not over. The story continues, and now you are part of it. What will you do with this knowledge? How will you honor what you have learned? The choice, as always, is yours. The great law of peace is calling. Will you answer?